This Zoom webinar will be recorded. So just please be mindful of that in terms of that includes the chat. And I just started recording, so it won't, what was posted before will not be seen, but from here on out, everything in the chat will be part of the recording. That's how Zoom works. Also, what we're asking attendees is to please, if you have, or if you have a question or comment, if you could use the Q&A, it's a lot easier for us to keep focus on the question and answers, as opposed to in chat. It's like you have to keep scrolling and figuring it out, but at least Q&A, we can have a chance to see what's going on. So my name is Aishah Shahidah Simmons, and I am the editor of Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse, and very, very happy to have the second book talk with 5 of the contributors, of the 40 diasporic Black contributors to the anthology. On Monday, April 27th, we had the inaugural book talk. And so it's really, really glad to continue this conversation. And so just to kind of let everyone know how the program will run, is that each of the 5 contributors will read an excerpt from their chapter. And from afterwards, I will engage with them about what they wrote and what they're sharing in their reading. So we'll do that so that there's 5 people. And then after that, we will all come back on and engage in conversation with each other and with all of you. And I asked everyone to please be present just for this opening so we can all see everyone's faces, and just also want to acknowledge and just express a lot of gratitude to the interpreters. Right now, you're seeing Yolanta Galloway, and you will see Pamela Collins and Nicole Schamberger, who graciously and generously donated their time to provide services to make this webinar accessible, though it is not widely accessible, because we do know that there are members in the deaf and hard of hearing community who need live captioning over and above or in addition to ASL. And so we're just grateful that this is one step, and we'll continue to make more movements to making all of our webinars accessible. So I will just want to begin and open that for those of us who are looking at this Zoom, and I think probably everybody is in this hemisphere, from Alaska over to Canada, all the way down to Argentina, that we remember that we are on occupied land that was taken by force, that genocide is rampant throughout the history of genocide throughout the Americas. So that's not something that's just unique to what's known as the United States, formerly known as Turtle Island. It is throughout. And so that we just remember that this country and all of the nations was founded on genocide, on theft of indigenous land, on enslavement of African people, of free labor. So that is the foundation, right? And so that when we're talking about child sexual abuse in the pandemic contemporarily, that we have to also remember that this is part of a continuum, and that we have a lot of work to do to undo this violence, and to really think about what does it mean to undo the violence without replicating or mirroring the violence that was done. And that is a lot. That's not easy work for any of us, and it's definitely for those of us whose bodies have been violated repeatedly by those many of who said they loved us, and who maybe do love us in their own complicated, complex ways. And so how do we respond with humanity in response to inhumanity? So I will just ask everyone to just take a moment to focus on breath and bodies, or focus on sensation. If breath is triggering, I mean, we all need oxygen to breathe, but for some people, and particularly if you have asthma or trauma in terms of closing one's eyes, can be traumatic. For me, closing my eyes helps to ground me, but you can keep your eyes wide open, but let's just take a moment to ground and center ourselves, to creating, at least for these 2 hours, sacred space virtually as well as in the space that we are cultivating sacred space. We are centering diasporic Black survivors, recognizing, however, that their survivors are everywhere, and no race, gender, culture, nationality, physical ability, mental ability, that it just transcends it all. So we just really want to just take a moment in honor of survivors of a pandemic that very few want to acknowledge or talk about, and to remember that children are always sheltering in place, that COVID is the latest, but they're sheltering in place unless they become runaways. And so let's just remember that, and remember the children that we once were if we are adults, and the children that are here, and thinking about what we can do to create a safe space. So I'll take a moment. Thank you. So now I'm going to invite my co-panelists to please turn off your cameras and stay on mute, and it will just be myself and Yolanto as I just read an excerpt from the anthology. On Monday, read I'm reading from the introduction, and I really vacillated about, should I read again what I already read? And I actually think I should, just to set a context for the anthology. I think that it's really important. So I apologize if you were here on Monday and you have to hear me read it again. And if you weren't here, you get to hear me read it for the first time. I am committed to co-creating communal space responses to intraracial, gender-based violence outside of the criminal justice system. I believe people who commit harm in our communities must be held accountable. Black feminist scholar, cultural critic, and prolific author Dr. Bell Hooks wrote, and I quote, "For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed?" Close quote. I do not believe incarceration is the answer. Prisons are not focused on rehabilitation, but instead are a kind of modern day enslavement, as the incarcerated are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and Latinx, and are raped and degraded while in prison. Too often, family and community bystanders ignore child sexual abuse, but the prison system does worse, facilitating its continuation. Equally as important, so many US laws that are in place to protect victim survivors of child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual and domestic violence end up severely punishing and harming survivors more than helping. The National Coalition Survived and Punished has not only documented this frightening reality, its members also, quote, organized to decriminalize efforts to survive domestic violence and sexual violence, support and free criminalized survivors, and abolish gender violence, policing, prisons, and deportations, close quote. I believe every victim survivor must take the avenues that best support their full recovery and total healing. Strongly advocating for alternatives to the criminal and justice system helps to deeply interrogate how and why calling the police has been presented as the only solution to the violence that victim survivors face, especially when so many of them are victimized again when the police or any representative of the criminal justice system becomes involved. What are the ways in which we can hold harm doers accountable without getting involved with the very state that brutalizes Black and other communities of color? How do we create accountability mechanisms that address the needs of the immediate survivors without discarding the harm doers, including bystanders? What are the alternatives to prisons that hold people who commit harm accountable by giving them consequences for the horrible atrocities that they commit? What do community accountability, transformative justice, and restorative justice look like in response to child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence? My goals for this anthology are to provide roadmaps, multiple, that explore how we can disrupt, end, and prevent child sexual abuse. These writings have emerged from the lived experiences of a collective of diasporic Black child sexual abuse survivors, advocates, and one former bystander, my mother. The anthology includes most of the texts that were originally published in the Feminist Wire, with some revisions. Additionally, there are 15 new contributors. Although I was unable to cover all of the perspectives that I had hoped for, I am grateful for my sibling comrades who are part of this anthologized journey. I'm especially grateful for my mother's efforts to not only be accountable to me for what I endured, but to also be publicly accountable through her contribution to this volume, through which she underscores the detrimental impact of parents and caregivers not believing their children. Many of the contributors in this anthology do not believe in police involvement in response to child sexual abuse. However, there are several who believe that we must make use of what few resources exist while we co-create something different for the future. Despite my core beliefs about the imperative need to completely dismantle the criminal and justice system and abolish the prison industrial complex, I intentionally include diverse perspectives that aren't necessarily in agreement with each other in this anthology. I believe it is important to be in compassionate conversation with people who do not hold the same perspectives, but share a goal of naming, disrupting, and ultimately ending child sexual abuse along with other forms of violence. It is my affirmation that every single one of us will make the commitment to refrain from marginalizing, or worse, condoning child sexual abuse or any other form of gender-based violence in the name of any greater issue, which in communities of color often means solely focusing on ending white supremacy. Having your body violated and invaded against your will as a child and also as an adult is a non-negotiable atrocity that must be addressed. The eradication of racism and white supremacy alone will not make our families and communities safe. We should not have to be murdered by white vigilantes, the police, or any other apparatus of the state in order for our communities to believe that harm has been committed. For many survivors of child sexual abuse, physical death is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen to us, especially when we have to engage with our harm doers over and over and over and over again without any form of accountability. What I have learned so far through this work and through my own personal journey is that love with accountability is hard. Perhaps nothing is harder, but it is worth the struggle. Child sexual abuse by its nature is complex, and together we must co-create accountability systems that honor that complexity. Until we do, we will not end this epidemic. And so I need to slow down, Aisha, and I did not start with my pronouns, which I think is very important that we all know each other's pronouns. And so I use she, her, and hers. I also, because in my introduction, I give my story, and I'm very intentional in not giving my story because I'm holding the space, and I just can't open that up while I hold the space. But it is important that everyone know that I'm a Black feminist lesbian, I am a child sexual abuse survivor, and I'm an adult rape survivor. So I just want to be visible in that way, and will engage about my story if people want to know about that in the conversation. So I will, let me just do a check with Yolanta. I'm going to bring in Edxie. Do you want to switch, or are you okay? All right, thank you. So our first reader, contributor this evening is Edxie Betts. And I've had just, I think Edxie and I met in person at the Color of Violence Conference 4 in 2015 in Chicago. And Edxie is just, she is an incredible organizer, activist, artivist, who I continue to learn so much from. And her essay closes the anthology, and that's very intentional because I really believe that she poses some really important questions around the nationhood, state, consent, accountability. And I really wanted to end on her words as a call for us to begin to think outside of boxes, as we envision a world where it is not based on domination. So welcome, Edxie.
Thank you. Oki, hi. Hi, I'm Edxie. My pronouns are they, she, and I'm currently residing in on Tongva land, which is also known as Los Angeles. Yeah, I guess I can just begin by saying that I am also a survivor, as well as, Aishah had mentioned, multimedia artist. I do a lot of organizing in my communities, and here's my piece. It's called Confronting Harm, Past and Present for Tomorrow. As much as individuals often seem to bear the blame for abuse or sexual assault, cultures of apologism are often the reason why this harm has gone on unchecked for so long. Whether within movements such as in Black Power, Indigenous resistance, undocuqueer communities, or within our own families, it's the reputation of the hardworking patriarch or even the nurturing mother that often absolves these communities of accountability. And it leaves many to drown in silence and heartache from past situations that should have been confronted. When it comes to the people or person who perpetuates harm, we have to look at the issue in a way that ensures that this harm doesn't occur again. We have to have critical examination of the social hierarchies that may compel some to remain silent. In my accounts of mediating abuse, I have often encountered obstacles when someone who has committed harm, the abuser, does not acknowledge their own harmful behavior. This creates a fundamental problem with restorative accountability itself. The process shouldn't wholly be left up to the conscience of the person doing harm, because we're often seeing that person not heed their conscience or feel remorse at all. So when the behavior goes unchecked or unaccounted for, sanctions might have to occur, and or boundaries must be created to prevent future harm. This does not have to be punitive or restorative for a relationship between someone who has experienced harm and someone who has committed harm, nor should this be relegated to a carceral solution. Child sexual abuse, CSA, is likely occurring even when children are unaware. This is why conversations about consent and political education are so important to address in a communal setting with children, teenagers, adults, and yes, even elders. Children especially need to be taught that they have the ability to give permission to whoever touches their bodies and when. In this summer of 2018, I participated in an initiative co-organized by community partners and the Mirror Memoirs Project to train homeless shelter workers on how to intake trans and gender nonconforming peoples in trauma-informed ways. During the initiative, I learned the following, quote, according to the US Centers for Disease Control, 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys will experience sexual abuse by the age of 18. According to the Harvard School of Public Health, for gender nonconforming children, the rates are even higher. Gender nonconforming children who are designated male at birth are especially vulnerable, up to 6 times likelier to be sexually abused. Studies suggest that this is due to a lack of family support for transgender and gender nonconforming children. That means many transgender and gender nonconforming clients experience childhood trauma and especially child sexual abuse, end quote. So this trauma is compounded when factoring in the experiences of growing up impoverished on indigenous reservations or the res in the hood. These conditions, in combination with the condition of white supremacy, constructed poverty, and police state sanctioned violence, make post-traumatic stress disorder a normal occurrence. This compounded trauma makes many of us targets for further sexual abuse when we are alienated by gender policing. Additionally, we don't talk about consent when it comes to our gender identity. Consenting to whom we wish to be has never been the topic of discussion. It isn't a surprise that even wealthy celebrities have shared similar experiences of sexual and gender violence that extend beyond class and cultural lines. I hope the #MeToo movement, like other movements against sexual assault, can center more messages and testimonies on the absolute importance of getting consent. This includes explaining what consent is, what it means, and how to properly acquire it. More importantly, however, we must acknowledge the relationship between consent and the root causes of sexual assault that stem from the state. Its violence and coercive strategies, its colonization of communities, and corporate control of media. I want to expand these communal conversations about reclaiming our consent and accountability beyond the parameters that the state has provided and confined us in. We must include and simultaneously move beyond our interpersonal sexual encounters. While it's especially important to this conversation, we shouldn't always need to sexualize the notion of getting consent. We need to teach children that they should receive consent before they touch someone. We need to teach children that they have the right to say no when someone wants to touch their bodies without explicit consent. We also must remember that asexual people exist. They too should not be thrust into unwanted sexual encounters and have to practice consent in their everyday lives. Consent doesn't have to be sexy. Consent is not an ideology so much as it is a cultural mode of expression that can help us counter the dominant white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture and economies of violence. We're all being socialized by a state that was conceived of and maintained by coercion, rape culture, propriety, and domination. How can we have real conversation with each other about consent when we aren't simultaneously expanding our understanding and analysis of the relationship between consent and coercion and how we are governed? We shouldn't continue to allow the state to be the mediator of these interpersonal harms that occur in our communities, especially within colonized communities. As long as we collectively ignore the original harm that the state has imposed and still imposes on indigenous peoples from the so-called Americas, we will always be under a colonial rapist regime. To be clear, this requires tremendous emotional, psychological, spiritual, and physical labor to dismantle, delegitimize, disband divest from and abolish an entire system of governmental apparatuses coordinating with other interlocking systems of domination. But we must. This requires mass withdrawal from the carceral state and mass implementation of shared, autonomous conflict resolution models. One such model is community accountability, which encompasses transformative justice work. Entire communities or other configurations of large groups of people could be organized and taught to rely upon one another to resolve conflicts in ways that highlight and center the survivors of harm and abuse. Tragically, transformative justice work and care work have been mostly relegated to feminized labor. Men and those who benefit from masculinity must do more to assume the responsibility of using the required emotional labor and communication skills to resolve conflicts. I'm still developing my thoughts on how we can live within a punishment culture, and also how people who claim to be using an abolitionist lens today aren't using the same abolitionist practices that former enslaved people took up to free themselves from being owned property. In my view, the strategy of co-opting abolitionist rhetoric without adopting abolitionist practices is entrenched with liberal Western binary logic that fails to see different levels of power. It has established a false dichotomy that dismisses any force or violence as bad or depraved practice that only proliferates more violence. The state shouldn't have a monopoly on force or even the violence necessary to defend oneself from its harm. How can many liberal career abolitionists today continue to demonize past slave revolts, current militant counter-violence, and direct actions? There is undoubtedly violence that has been deployed strategically by and for the love of survivors or oppressed peoples who have experienced intergenerational systemic harm. To want and will for the state-sanctioned violence to no longer exist is to want and will for the state to no longer exist. Our collective demand is to end violence. Our collective demand to end violence must not make invisible how the state fortifies itself through organized violence, conceived and sustained through its own hegemonic power by way of historical ableism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, capitalism, and white supremacist heteropatriarchy. That's all.
How are you, Yolanta? You're good? You want to switch? Okay. Oh, no. Pam? All right. Great. Edxie, where'd you go? I just wanted to ask you one question. Thank you for sharing. And I just wanted to thank you, and just to have one question, just to be mindful of time. As when I your essay, the entire in its entirety, really challenged me to because I have been the person who's been like, consent, is sexy and all that. So just really thinking about consent in the context of just consent, period, and thinking about children whose bodies have been violated without their even knowing it, from very young, or even bigger children where they're not even aware. And I really appreciate your not only lifting the work of Mere Memoirs, but really talking about the reality for gender nonconforming and trans children in terms of their right to consent around gender identity. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk about any of that beyond just reading, if you'd like to touch upon that a little, and then we'll bring on Alicia.
Yeah, I definitely bring in what I've learned from just my relationship to gender. And I feel like the piece about consent, I've definitely gleaned a lot from Indigenous relatives in terms of how establishing prior informed consent is very related to Indigenous land defense. It's if we don't consent to you to be on specific lands without knowing what you're there for, you know, have every right to make a kind of boundary. And I feel like a lot of larger, well, the state and these companies, it's not following those kinds of models, as well as like how many cultures, you know, not to like romanticize like how we lived pre-colonization, but like a lot of us still exist, and to acknowledge that trans and two-spirit, gender expansive peoples have existed and were thriving and had like an actual positions of importance, in how colonization has demonized those positions with its own kind of negative nomenclature. So yeah, I just think like gender nonconformity is very much of a it's very much of a, yeah, just something that most children kind of like have like this fluidity. And I think in my piece I wanted to relate that to how I was treated by, you know, whether it be classmates or teachers, and how I was really trying to hide that kind of feminine parts of myself so that I wouldn't be, you know, in acknowledging that kind of like targeting that I would see. But, you know, regardless of that, I feel like people still saw that and targeted me anyway. But yeah, that's all I guess I want to say about that.
Thank you. All right, so we'll bring on Alicia, please. Hello, Alicia.
Hi.
And so really happy that you're here. And Alicia is a dear friend and comrade, and has been working in the anti-violence movement for a long time. And not, you know, anti-violence has in many ways become like a euphemism for just sexual violence, when we say anti-violence movement in that type of way. And that you've really been standing, working, moving, located, trying not to use ableist languages, at intersections of multiple forms of violence, and really exploring how we can eradicate all of them without replicating it. And so your chapter, Networks of Care, and I know what you're going to read, so I won't say, but I just always, every time I look at insects, I always think about you in terms of how Mother Nature really works, and it doesn't have to be Mother Nature, just nature really works to sustain itself. And so I think about that a lot. And so I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you, dear one. Thank you, beloved. I'm so grateful to be in space with all of you, for the folks who are here listening in, and for the other panelists who are sharing their stories tonight. My name's Alicia Sanchez Gill. I am a queer Afro-Latinx survivor of childhood sexual violence, adult sexual violence, and family violence. And I am based on traditional Piscataway land, otherwise known as Washington, D.C. area. And so I'm going to be reading from my chapter as well. So child sexual abuse, by its very nature, demands shame and isolation. Often our abusers have manipulated our voices through violence and coercion. They have counted on our shame and silence, and the silence of those around us. For many of us, our relationship to concepts of disclosure, justice, and accountability have been complicated by our relationship to our abusers. So many survivors, like me, were harmed by the folks closest to us, the ones who were supposed to keep us safe, the ones who look like us and speak our language in a world where we are so often othered. It's confusing because our abusers hurt us and then help us finish science projects, or took us to church, or bought us ice cream. It hurts because our abusers are still here, at Sunday dinners, at graduations, at holiday gatherings. For many survivors, having to choose between speaking our truth and losing loved ones, or remaining silent and keeping them, is a devastating form of negotiation we should never have to go through. The radical, loving choice for those around us is to dismantle our culture of quiet. I have a vision for a place where children are protected from violence, a place where they are supported the very first time they experience harm, a place where families have conversations about consent and boundaries and healthy masculinity before abuse happens. I have a vision for a place where parents and teachers have paid sick leave, living wages, and time to be attuned to their children's and students' needs and behaviors. A place where families are ripped apart through deportations, policing, and the criminal industrial complex. A place where the protection of children is community-led and not institutionalized, where child safety, health, and well-being are not placed on solely on the shoulders of women and femmes. Networks of care for our children and for the adults who have survived means creating community-based prevention and responses to violence. Responses that do not engage in punitive justice, but hold perpetrators accountable and keep survivors safe. These allow us to wrestle with the dichotomies of good and bad and the various complexities and nuances of the communities with whom we are a part. This may involve affirming church communities, or it may involve family and friends. We, you and I, are often the first people to whom child sexual abuse survivors go when they share their experience, whether as children or as adults. They tell their families, their friends, their partners, their coworkers. By believing survivors, being prepared for crisis, and utilizing all of our resources in a coordinated and safe way, we can help survivors feel seen and heard and protect the children who have yet to come. In our networks of care, violence prevention will not happen through dependence on policing, but through divestment in any system that seeks to dominate, coerce, or control our communities. It will depend on each of us to interrupt violence. Recently, I watched a fascinating video of fire ants in action. Fire ants work together in such a closely coordinated way that when in danger, they can become a moving, protected, semi-solid structure. Yet, when a barrier falls in their way, like a tree branch, they're able to navigate around the barrier in a way that behaves almost like water, and not one ant got left behind. What if all of our networks of care could be like the fire ants, solid and coordinated, but adaptable and responsive to need? What if they all centered on safety, rehabilitation, accountability, and healing, creating communities where child sexual abuse is just no longer tolerated, but it's also eradicated? Where those of us who have survived are not left to pick up the pieces of our shame alone, but are met with the chorus of "we believe you and it's not your fault." Where people recognize that when violence happens, the whole community needs healing. For those of us who never told, or who told and weren't believed, for those of us who were left unprotected, we know the swelling of betrayal that rises up in our throats. Our stories are powerful calls to action. Our stories allow us to connect to one another and name our abuse and our abusers. Our stories are grounded in love for ourselves and our communities. Our stories help manifest the world we want to see. It is through deep and meaningful connections, these networks of care, that I was able to come back from my darkest edges and begin healing. what I've learned from survivors is that, like fire ants, it is our interdependence that will save us. That's it.
Thank you, Alicia. I love networks of care. I love I love ants. I don't want to live with them and I don't like them, but I just think that they're just really fascinating. And I bring that up in terms of when I read networks, when I read that analogy, I really have started looking at them very different. Like when I see them, I just think about that in terms of what would networks of care look like in response to child sexual abuse. For those who are being abused as children, and then those of us who are adults and working on this. So, and would love to just hear some of your thinking briefly for now, so everyone has had a chance to speak, but around examples of that now, or or even visions of it if it's speculative fiction. But yeah.
I think so much of this, I mean, we have so many practices. I was thinking back, tomorrow Insight is doing the 20-year, I think, anniversary Zoom call, which I'll be on. And I was thinking back to the first time I read speculative fiction around, like, what does a practice of holding folks accountable for gendered violence look like without utilizing the police. I came up in like very kind of mainstream sexual assault and domestic violence organizations. That's where I started my work. And so I didn't necessarily have a vision for what it looked like beyond that, but I knew it didn't feel right. And I knew that most of the survivors that I was working with on an interpersonal level, that wasn't necessarily their top choice, but for most of us, it was the only choice, right? Many of us like had to negotiate between either calling the police or not calling anyone at all. And we just didn't have the kinds of networks of care and communities that we actually needed in place to support survivors, both supporting folks before violence happens, but then supporting folks afterwards. So I was thinking back, and one of the first books I ever read that gave me a possibility of what it could look like was The Color of Violence. And then the second, which I know you're featured in, right? You're in that anthology, so shout out to you. And then the second thing that I read that really transformed me was The Revolution Starts at Home. And what was so powerful about that work was that it was like written by other queer folks, right? Other queer folks of color. And it gave me language for thinking about how we might work outside of state systems that were literally never intended to protect us, and in fact were intended to harm us. I think about, Edxie, what you shared about just like the lack of consent in colonization and policing and deportation. And then I think about the ways that that shows up right now, even in the fact that the state can prosecute abuse without the cooperation of survivors, right? So we know that the state's interest is not necessarily in justice for their survivor, but it's really in the interest of justice for the state. And so I think that there are lots of examples of how folks are working around these systems in many communities across the United States, folks, and across the whole world, right? Folks are creating community accountability circles. Folks are practicing, and many of the things that we're practicing are actually not new. They're not new to our communities. They're not new, like, culturally to us, right? The idea of coming together and gathering to make deliberations, the idea of, we do it every year at family reunions when we fight over who's winning spades, right? Like, we have like some tactics around, like, not to minimize it, right? But we have tactics for the ways that we come together to hold folks accountable, right? I think it's about taking those tools that we've already used, whether that's in religious contexts or familial context, and then applying them to sexual assault, which is often where we seem to have a lot of challenge. But there are so many amazing groups and so many amazing books around the country of folks who are organizing around these issues, who are organizing to ensure that survivors aren't incarcerated, like you mentioned, Aishah, to ensure that survivors have additional options, right? I think that sometimes when we talk about options outside of the state, people think that we mean like that we won't use the state at all. And of course, I think in a perfect world we wouldn't, but some survivors still need that, right? And so while that is happening, we are still building the world that we want to see, a world that can be a safety net for survivors and can really catch them when violence happens. And we're doing that by deepening our relationship with one another, and then by ensuring that people have the like financial and other kinds of resources, whether that's mental health support or housing, right? Like basic needs met, so that they can find safety. Because it's just really hard to find safety, particularly for children, when you don't even have your basic needs met. That's a lot, but.
Thank you. And we'll, as I shared in the beginning, this is recorded, this Zoom recording, and a lot of us are sharing resources that I'll make available for people to learn. So these titles and all that, you don't have to like jot down things. That all this will be accessible via a PDF link for everyone. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Pam, do you need to change? And we'll bring Kai on, please. And are you okay, Pam, or is someone? Okay. All right. All right, so Kai Green, I mean, I should say all the contributors, whether I knew them before I started working on the book or after, they've all become friends and comrades. Kai was definitely a friend before the book, and just incredible scholar, culture worker, artist. Have had the just joy of working with him on several projects, and just consider him to be a very dear friend. I love his I love everyone's chapter, but so let me just be clear about that. But your chapter, Fast, every time I read it, I love the way in which you use third person, yet talking about first person. So I will let you take it from there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for having me and for having all of us and for putting the work together to put this anthology together. It's an incredible resource for everyone. I'm going to be sharing from a section of Fast, and Fast is I use it for the way that people usually are naming young Black girls as fast, as a way to over-sexualize and pathologize young Black girls. And so this comes from that piece, Fast, which is also a segment from my memoir, A Body Made Home, which looks at the ways that little Black girl and Black mama traverse the world and how bodies are made, and gendered and racialized. So this is the coda to Fast. But the question that we are all to respond to in this book is, what does accountability look like after Black girl done become? After recounting Black girl's tale, which is not just her own, but of course, also her mother's shame, her auntie's denial, her cousin's tears, her play cousin's confusion, there are too many Black girl battleground body stories. The questions we are left with is, what does accountability look like when you are the only one who remembers what happened? What does accountability look like when you remind your loved ones of that thing that happened that was not love, and they say, I don't know what you're talking about, and walk away? How does silence fill your mouth after that? Your body remembers. Your Black girl's spirit remembers. You know what happened, and you want to heal, but there are no apologies to be had. You are forced to swallow an inherited silence that your Black family has built as a wall of protection. So what does accountability look like in the face of deep forgetfulness? It might look like walking away. It might look like a refusal to stop asking for those who were there to bear witness, tell the truth. In the end, I don't know what an accountability process for Black girl would look like. I know some things though. I know accountability requires responsibility. Those who have harmed must learn how to say, I have harmed, but I am not harmed. I have acted like a monster, but I am not a monster. Those who have harmed must commit to becoming better. Our Black families and communities need our people, and we need them to be well. Currently, we do not have enough tools or even language to articulate an effective model of accountability that does not replicate a carceral imaginary. Accountability requires an abolitionist ethic. We must ask ourselves, do we seek healing or punishment? The answer, of course, for most survivors fluctuates. Respect that. We must ask, what is the relationship between accountability and transformative justice? Justice that transforms harm into something else, like Black love, is hard work. This kind of justice changes both individuals and systems of oppression. In order to envision and create this new world, we sometimes have to suspend our notion of reality, which is always steeped in history. What we have experienced can sometimes confine our imaginations, so we have to work against that non-creative force. This work requires intentionality. What is accountability for Black girls whose bodies remember family secrets that were supposed to be kept buried, forgotten, but like ghosts, they rise? You must remember and affirm your truth in spite of forgetfulness. Accountability looks like even more struggle after the harm has been done, after the PTSD, after the nightmares, after all of that. Accountability looks like an investment in the healing of the harm doer. We desire for harm doers to cease harm, but accountability asks for something else of those who have been harmed. It asks us to believe that the harm doer can be different and do better. Accountability initiates transformation in the lives of those who are harmed and those who have harmed. Sometimes one person can be both. Accountability moves us towards a world where Black girl won't have to inherit Black mother's trauma. Black girl and Black mother no longer lean into the false protection of respectability politics, body policing, religion, and covering up. They can't be fly all bogged down like that. So I'll repeat it again for memory's sake. The worlds around Black girls' bodies must be reshaped to be able to hold her, fast as she may be. So quit slowing her down. She was made to fly. And that's it.
I love that. She's made to fly. I also really appreciate, you know, the line where you say, I have harmed, but I am not harmed, you know, and I've essentially paraphrasing, you know, I've committed monstrous acts, but I am not a monster. And just the such the complexities of how so often Black girls are demonized and blamed for the harm that we've experienced. And then the people who've caused the harm are also demonized in other ways. And so just would love for you to, if you want to, to really just talk about that tension, that journey around just your coming to the understanding to be able to even articulate it and write about it so brilliantly.
Yeah, I think some of why this is so hard is because we're having a lot of these interactions, these violent interactions with people that are family, that are in our family, that we see, like as Alicia was saying, these are people that we engage with over family dinners, at family reunions and things like that. And so how do you sort of deal with someone who's caused harm? And for me, the question was, how do you deal with it when everyone around is silent about it, when there is no sort of re-memory of it, no mass, let's talk about this, let's work this out. How do you hold on to that when it's sort of maddening, because it's as if you're the only one who remembers something that is so vivid and so memorable that you can't forget. As a survivor, I think about times where I would say, I wonder if there will be a day where I will not remember this moment. And so what does it mean to be that person who remembers when forgetfulness is all around you? And I say forgetfulness, but it might be forgetfulness, but it also can be a conscious sort of, it's about shame. It's about all of these things that make it difficult for folks to communicate about harm that happen between folks.
Yeah, it requires, it's like an intentional amnesia. And
Yeah.
if you break that silence, you're breaking the code.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Kai.
Thank you so much, Aishah.
Yes. Nina J. Nicole, are you okay? Do you need to change, Nicole, or is everything? You want to change? Okay.
We're switching to Yolanta. Yolanta, I love you, because I ain't trying to do that poem.
All right, is everybody okay? I feel like I think I've definitely have known you the longest in this whole group, Nina J, and so powerful that Alicia talked about the color violence anthology, which came out in 2006, and our point of entry was around I think the second color of violence conference in Chicago, and though we won't get into all of our history, but what I will share is I really appreciate the ways in which you have over the years just pushed me to be authentic as a survivor. And, you know, I want to tell about our journey, and maybe I will after everybody's had a chance around you and this powerful contribution. This is a gift, but I won't go there because I want to make sure we can go there afterwards. But Nina J is a poet and who really writes and speaks the unadulterated truth, and even the process of her contribution to this anthology that she invites all of us in before we actually get to the piece, because the journey is the piece.
First, I want to say thank you to Aishah. My pronouns are she and her. Thank you always, Aishah, and we can revisit that. And I want to thank all of my siblings that are in here. I feel very honored to do this work with you, and I feel, again, as I stated earlier, very safe to be doing this work with you tonight. And glad that it is just the 6 of us here. When I received the email from Aishah asking me to be a part of the Love with Accountability Forum, my immediate answer was yes. I believe in Aishah's work and I believe in her intentions. I read the word incest. I read the words child sexual abuse. It took me days, maybe even a couple weeks, to truly realize that I may not have heard her. Having worked in rape crisis centers, having written poems about rape and incest, having performed at Take Back the Night marches, perhaps it was possible that those words had become just words to me. Perhaps I distanced myself from them in ways I'm not aware of. Perhaps I have become numb. That's what I told myself. I didn't feel anything. That was not true. I felt anger. Why did I agree to do this? I told myself I had no idea what love with accountability means. I told myself Aishah was making me angry. She wanted too much. She's never satisfied. She's always pushing me. I told myself a lot of things, except this truth. I was afraid to intimately engage this process because the person I felt the least accountable to had been myself, to the parts of myself that needed healing. I understood that I was going to have to write, which for me meant jumping into a volcano and praying I would be able to climb back out without getting burned alive, but not being certain it would be possible. I had to decide it was worth the risk. I have decided it is worth the risk. So now the question becomes, who will do this writing, the speaking? There's the little girl who was raped by her uncle, then banished into the silent parts of my body, mind, and world for the last 39 years. There's also the woman who has already survived and is outspoken and powerful, who out of survival tends to ignore and silence the little girl. Each of them have very different things to say. But when I think about being accountable, I know it has to be the little girl who speaks. Any other reckoning would feel hypocritical. Every other person who needs to be held accountable for the blood in this child's story is dead. I am the only one left alive, the grown woman, the strong one, the outspoken one. I am the one who, even now, keeps the girl locked in a closet or some room inside this body. She is with me. First time I notice her, she is laughing. First time I notice her, she is bleeding. First time I notice her, I don't recognize her. There she was in the park alone, pushing a swing that held no other child. I try to ask her softly, who are you here with? Where are your parents? She runs away from me without answering. The only sound she makes is laughter. The only footprints she leaves are bloody. The entire inside of my body moans and groans. I run after her. She is just laughing and running, this bleeding child. Blood flings itself from her body as she runs. I can hear her laughter falling backward through the air, winding itself around her neck, through her ponytails, down her backbone, into my pain. Whose child is this? She turns a corner I didn't see. Night has come calling us. It is dark. I see a house. It's just an old house, just a regular house. The closer I get, the darker it gets. I reach to knock, the door just falls. Who lives here, I wonder? It doesn't look or smell like or feel like anybody is living in here. I've entered the house of mirrors, I think to myself. A house with locked doors that are not locked, a house with broken windows that are not broken. I follow her. Tiny, bloody footprints down the hall. Hey, hey. I stop before a door where the footprints disappear. My hand rests on the doorknob. I am terrified to turn it. But I know I gotta get to this kid. Perhaps some other adult has hurt her. Many other adults have seen her blood. Some other adult left her bleeding. But I am who is left. I now have seen this child. I now have smelled that blood. I think I know who this child is. I think that's me. I enter the room. The room is empty. Just a closet door. I am slowly walking backwards, but running to the closet, this house of mirrors. Somehow I know I don't want to find her. What am I going to see? But something in me knows she is not going to walk out of that closet. She needs me to find her there. She wants me. She wants me to open. She needs me to open that door. I know what's behind that door, and I don't want to see it. The mess he is making of her. I have lived my whole life trying to unsee it, trying to unknow it, trying to unfeel it, this bloody life. She wants me to know, to see just how he hurt her and where. She wants to show me perhaps what I pretend to want to know, just where the blood is coming from. She needs me to stop the bleeding. Wrap my hands around the open wound, hold it tight, look in her eyes, make sure she knows I am here. I will let her speak. I will let her cry. I will let her scream. I will dress her in clean clothes. I will slay that dragon for her. I will do what nobody ever did. I will love her more. I will wipe the blood from her mouth. I will let her use my throat. I will let her tell her story in her words. I will hold her. I will rock her and kiss her and believe her. I will let her live. I will let her heal. I will.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to take a breath. I want to just let everyone know when the reason we all agreed to this, but it was Enina J who really suggested that we read from our pieces to really bring in the stories and make it personal beyond just kind of out there. And so I just really want to thank you, Enina J, for just that invitation for all of us, and for sharing, and in your reclaiming your little girl. It is an invitation. I let me just speak for myself, to reclaim mine. And so I want to thank you. And I would like to briefly just talk about that process for you. Yeah.
That's broad.
I know it's broad because I'm like,
you want me to keep
I'm
it short. You know how I do.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, just really in terms of one of the things that we talked about was that you were just like, you're going to let her speak, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you could just touch on that before we go to Mel.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about, the word that stayed with me today was this middle. It's become a lot, and actually a very revolutionary, I'm recognizing a revolutionary act for and of myself, to give her the room to spread out, to not understand, to get in line with what's going on in the world, to come back alive. And she doesn't know everything I know, and I don't know everything she knows, and there's a lot of confusion in this journey. And I'm doing it out loud and allowing other people to bear witness to it, which makes it even more difficult. But there's something about that transparency that I find liberating as well. So yeah, I'm still in her story, so I already forgot what you asked me.
That's okay. All right. Well, we'll come back.
We'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you show her again? I just think it's so important that we remember, because particularly as adult survivors, I know for a lot of times when I think about the abuse I experienced as a child, I think about it as a 51-year-old woman, and I don't look at the little girl. So, the little, yeah. So thank you.
It came to me later in the day today, as I was trying to, because I wanted to make sure that I didn't interrupt what was going on tonight and take over with more of my voice. And I wanted to make sure that she was present in the room with me and not just present inside my body, and that I was being held accountable to her in this way as well. So that's why she's here. And can I just say one thing, and I'll keep it short? I noticed that, well, first of all, there aren't many photos of me. My mom died at the same time, so I didn't get up a lot of attention. So there are not many photos of me as a child, maybe 4 or 5, but they're all smiling. And we learned this at that age too. Like, I was in pain, you know what I'm saying? But look, I'd already learned, that this is what my face should look like as a little girl. You know what I'm saying? And unlike Kai, my brother Kai, nobody pretended not to remember. Everybody remembered and just made the conscious and out loud choice to not deal with that in my face. I respect that. But everybody is remembering, but nobody is willing to have that conversation and willing to go down that path. And so, yeah, it's just me and her for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. I love you.
I love you. All right, Mel, if you could come on, and Mel, if you could turn off your camera. Hello, Mel. Thank you for being here. Oh, we're changing who to Pam. We're just doing a shift. Is Pam coming on? Okay, we'll wait 1 second. Okay, there she is. Hi. All right. Mel, I've known you the least, and you feel like I feel like I've known you forever. Mel and I were in a cohort from the Just Beginnings Collaborative, which was a Just Beginnings Collaborative is a collaborative whose mission and work is to end child sexual abuse humanely. And we were in a cohort of survivor activists and organizational grantees, all of whom are, survivors of child sexual abuse, and all of us are working to end child sexual abuse. So over these past few years, I've had the opportunity to get to know and love Brother Mel, and his piece, the compassion imperative. When the moment I read it, and when he found that, when I told him I was doing this anthology and asked him if he had anything to contribute, and he shared that, it's a very powerful piece, and I'll let you share it, but I just I think about our brothers in Angola prison. I think about our brothers who have survived child sexual abuse, and in the ways in which we don't talk about it as much as we should. And we don't talk about it at all, but then when we do talk about it, we often forget the boys and the trans children and the gender nonconforming people. So thank you, along with Kai, along with Edxie, for really centering that in your work.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and I really appreciate this opportunity, and thanks for my siblings here on this with us, because it's really wonderful and lovely company. The piece that I'll be reading from was actually an 8-year journey from thinking about something and then having it happen. So the compassion imperative was a keynote speech that I was honored to give at Angola prison in Louisiana. And the event was the very first day of compassion. And after 8 years of thinking, trying, and actually real intention to change my mindset and pivot to a different direction that I thought would move my work forward, this is what came of that. So the compassion imperative: from hurt to healing, a new north. I see you, I feel you, I got you. You are not alone. Family, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances would say that I'm a decent, free-spirited, open-minded, pure of heart kind of guy, and they'd be right to a point. But I wasn't anything like that young lady, not by a long shot. Truth was that in many ways, my spirit was anchored to a hard place in my consciousness, allowed to roam only a few lengths from that spot. That wide door of perceived mindfulness opened only for some and only so far. I was a good person trapped in a mental lockup of my own design. It wasn't until I decided to engage compassion that I learned to put this underused inner guidance system to good use. Without knowing, I'd been slightly misdirected in my social justice aim, a bit off course in my mission, and sometimes I totally missed the point of my calling. Presently, as I set my essential being on a more compassionate course, the needle of awareness is guiding the values of my vessel. Compassion directs me, buoys me, steadies me, and guides me in crises arise. My hope is uplifted by the life raft that compassion provides for me and others in need. I know the mighty power of self-compassion. As a victim of violent crime, I can attest personally to its healing property. Still, in all honesty, it was a long time coming. For a long minute, I was chained to an ideal, closely bound to certain notions of righteousness and masculinity that, in ways that I did not notice, barred my mind from reaching outside this construct of what I believed was justice. Yet it was in this moment of recollection and reckoning with my little self that the light bulb in my head just seemed to instantly turn on like a switch. Compassion The thing that had been denying myself and others was, in itself, the antidote for my very own hurts. It was a potent pill resting in the palm of my hand the whole time, a tiny caplet of humanity, unused and still secure in its original silver lining. Compassion for others and myself is what redirected my life, shifted my mindset, moved my restive heart, and recalibrated my moral GPS. I am in a better course, following a new north, a brighter guide star called compassion. Compassion is power you can hold. To really understand the raw gravity of it, you must start with self-compassion. What a wonderful thing to be able to say to yourself, I see you, I feel you, I got you, you are not alone. And what a wonderful thing to be able to say to someone else or a stranger, I see you, I feel you, I got you, you are not alone. So maybe some of you are here because you abused, misused, or lost control of your power. Now your power is modified, limited, restricted, repealed, and suspended. But does this make you so powerless that you're unable to relieve your own suffering? Not if you turn to each other with compassion. The truth is, all you have is each other. That's all, and it's enough. Experience the healing power of compassion, starting with you. The healing ointment you need rests just beneath the palms of your hands, just beneath your feet, at the tips of our toes, at the tips of our fingers, and on the tips of our very own tongues. Compassion is an intense, forceful act of resistance against inhumanity. It's an act of courage and grace, and it's only this far away from us. Our sun is 93 million miles away from us, but with the right perspective, I can hold it between my finger and thumb. Sometimes we feel like we're 93 million miles away from any kind of salvation, honor, or redemption, atonement, or comfort, or forgiveness. But with compassion, the space between hurting and healing is reduced exponentially. Instead of being 93 million miles away from grace, the possibility is just this far away. Step out, reach out, speak out. Compassion is the cure for the suffering human condition, and it's almost always within our grips. I stand before you right now as a person in change, not so much a changed man, but rather a changed mind. Not so much resurrected, but more like redirected. Today, the glowing quasar of compassion is what guides my personal path and life work. Today, I perceive my worldview through a different, much more compassionate lens. Lack of compassion is a cell of its own, and I can't live there anymore. I need to make space for this thing. There is space for a new reality, and in this space, there is room for us all. I reach out right now to every pulsating one to say, I feel you. I speak out today in this harsh and humble environment to say to all incarcerated persons here today, I see you, I feel you, I hear you, and I thank you. I got you. You are not invisible. You are not disposable. You are not unredeemable. You do have value. Your life has worth. You are not without power. You are not debris. Your life is significant. You can make a difference. You are enough, and you are not alone. Peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mel. Yeah, the compassion imperative. Whew. I'm so shaken from everything.
Well, and this is what I'll say with you and I, Aisha, when we first talked about where you are and where I was in the moment that we met and talked about love with accountability, and I wasn't quite there. My mindset says I need something else. This is a shock to my system. It's too much. So thinking about that and thinking about what I did with compassion, for me, it was a long journey for sure. It started first with just abusing my relationships, hurting the people who loved me the most. And after a while, I had to take in that inner child, kind of like a lot of us are talking about, and look at myself in a completely different way. One thing about compassion that is true, it is not love with accountability. Compassion is not love with accountability. Compassion is its own thing. I will say though, when at the beginning you mentioned someone saying that compassion and forgiveness are usually linked, inextricably linked, something like that. And I think that has been historically true in our country, given our religious sensibilities and our Christian values. It seems like compassion and forgiveness go hand in hand. And I want to push back against that a little bit, because they can be mutually exclusive. Yeah, so for me, the whole compassion thing, I had to look at myself first before I could move this dial of child sex abuse. And the issue that I found, it wasn't society, it wasn't anything, it was me. It was my mindset. It was this rigid way of thinking where I would deny my father to save my mother. But with love, with accountability, we can kind of get both. So yeah, I didn't want to deny one just to be able to keep the other. But as Sister Enina J was talking about, what happens when nobody takes the accountability or nobody is around? One thing with self-compassion is that that can give us that healing tool, that thing that that person who is unwilling or not around anymore can give us. We can give that to ourselves, but I think the biggest point for me is that compassion, I think, is what I would say the springboard to love with accountability. I can see love with accountability now because I've been working with compassion, not with forgiveness, but with compassion. And with that compassionate view of myself and my harmers, I might be able to take that step into love with accountability. I think compassion is that drawbridge. We talked about this, the drawbridge between that grief and grace. You're here, I'm here. But without compassion, we're stuck. But with compassion, I can certainly get closer to where you're at, and we might be able to close that gap. Love with accountability is big, and it's too big for a lot of us, but compassion is a really great step to be able to take for the next steps of love with accountability. So.
Thank you, Mel. So now, I don't know, Pam, if you need to switch, we're gonna bring if all the panelists can turn on their cameras, stay muted, but turn on the cameras so we can have everyone. And then, Pam, how are you? Are you okay, or are you switching? Okay. And then, where's Enina? Everybody switching. All right. So, now let me pin and then go back. Okay. I want to just, so we're now at 7:28, just to give everyone a time thing, and want to leave some space for questions from people who may want to ask questions, but also wanted to give all of us, or all of you, I don't need to an opportunity if you all want to engage, and just to please be mindful of the time in terms of how we engage with each other, because it's not every day that we can all be in the same space. And I still, as I shared with, I think the first group I wrote, I want to do something where all 40 of us are in the room, hopefully in the literal room, but even if it's the virtual room. So just to give you all a chance to engage with each other, if you want to. I don't want to force anybody, but I do want to say, Mel, I want to, remind you to do what you said you were going to do about love with accountability. But, yeah.
There you go.
Yes, thank you very much. One thing I'd like to say to everyone out there watching or listening, I love reading. I love learning. And this book that I'm so proud to be a part of is one of the greatest anthologies. And this isn't hyperbole, it's one of the greatest anthologies I've had in my hands in a very long time. This book is full of some of the greatest American writers living right now. Some of the greatest American poets living right now, and a lot pretty much universally unknown. But I do believe that this text will stand the test of time. This text is so rich. What Edxie said in the beginning, and then what Alicia says in the middle with the fire ants. I mean, there's so much construction around this book, so much thought in the social realm, in the philosophical realm, in the ethical realm, in the science realm, in the writing realm. There's so much richness, diversity, depth, and voice in this anthology. It is not what most people, I think, would expect. Full of jewels, full of wisdom, full of real meaning and intention. It's not like anything I've ever read. 40 of the best American nonfiction stories I've ever read, that they happen to be centered in the way that we have it, does not take away from, actually I think adds to the real depth and importance of this book. I'm just so proud to be part of it. So anyone listening, if you can get your hands on it, and you can, in any kind of way, it's more than something to uplift us. It's a real story, a real book, a real historical chronicle. I think that we should all be very proud of, and more people should read.
Thank you, Mel. And I just want to also acknowledge, because I see them in the chat, Luz Marquez Bimbo, Tanya Lovelace, Rosa Cabrera, Gwendolyn Zahar Simmons, who's also my mom, that they are our sibling contributors who are also in the space with us. So just really wanting to acknowledge the village, because it really is a village. I see it as a chorus, all singing for justice in worlds without violence.
How incredibly beautiful to not feel alone in this moment. I think so many of our stories are marked with like feelings of isolation, and very real intentional isolation. It's not just a feeling, right? It's like a reality for our lives of being isolated from ourselves, of being isolated sometimes from our families, of being isolated from other survivors, or not having the language to talk about it. And so I'm just really emotional by seeing all of your faces on the screen and seeing so many of our siblings in the chat as well. It's just really beautiful. I also just wanted to say that this question that Rose is lifting up around compassion, and wondering if other folks can speak on how compassion played a role in your healing journey. I think Inina J talked about this, like, how do we get accountability from folks who either don't want to be accountable or are no longer here to be accountable? And I think that for me, because my abuser, and I share this in the book, but because the first person who sexually assaulted me committed suicide, there was never a reckoning with him. And then kind of very little reckoning in my own family, because I think that folks thought, well, the harm is removed, right? So there's nothing else that we need to do here, right? Because he is no longer here to hurt you. And so I think that this is where compassion has been so important for me, and for myself mostly. You know, I had a lot of regret around, maybe I should have told earlier, maybe I should have done different things, maybe this, maybe that. I was 7. Like, I probably couldn't have done a lot of stuff differently. I definitely did the best I could. And I think for many of us, we really grapple with feelings of guilt and shame. And so I think that, like Mel said, like a lot of that compassion just really starts with ourselves, and honoring that we did literally all kinds of things to survive. Some even weren't pretty, right? Like, we've done all kinds of things to get to this place where we're sitting on a Zoom call talking about our lives, and that just really deserves a lot of honor and gratitude. So I honor y'all.
Can
Yeah.
you read Rosa's question, Alicia? If you
Sure, I can read Rosa's question. Yeah, it says, Rosa, I'm going to just read your question. Hi. It says, I really felt what Mel said about compassion. I personally can't see love with accountability being possible without compassion happening on all ends. And thank you for not conflating compassion with forgiveness. I'm wondering if other folks can speak on, if relevant, how compassion played a role in your healing journeys. Compassion for yourself and for others.
I think I want to respond to that, and I want to really thank Nina J for bringing up what it means to have a relationship with the little girl, and the little person that you were, and what does it mean to have compassion for that person that may have felt shame, may still be holding on to that shame. So for me, a lot of my healing process is looking back at that little girl that I once was as a trans man, and thinking, what do you need that you didn't get? Are there ways that I can hold you when you weren't held? Can I do that now? What kinds of conversations can we have? And I think, like Nina J said, there are things that you can teach me that I don't know about how I'm living my life now, that are directly connected to how that little girl was harmed or abandoned or hurt. And so how do I have compassion for the way that I move my shape in the world in this moment, and think about all of those things that have shaped me and how they condition the way I process and relate to other people. So I think thinking about compassion as a survivor is really important for the self, really for the self, but also I would say compassion for me, I've had to think about it in relationship to my harm doers, and thinking about what it means to acknowledge that they also experienced harm and trauma. And it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean that what happened to me doesn't matter, but it does mean that I can see and understand and have compassion for what has happened to us both, what has happened to us all in this relation.
I just want to say that, yeah, thank you so much, Aishah. Thank you everyone for the amazing work that you're doing, the the perspective that you bring. I want to also thank my my 2 older sisters and my mom for being such strong, amazing people in terms of what kind of violence and abuse that we've experienced from my father. And yeah, I think just in relation to the question, I think there was for me, there was that wanting to be in solidarity with my sisters who were abused by my father. And I think for the kind of what he did and how it kind of created, it's kind of like this cycle or these kinds of violences that, you know, spread, that I felt as well. And I think, yeah, just wanting to really thank Aishah for really sitting with me. And I think I would call you like crying, like I don't think I'm ready to open up about like my own personal not having dealt with it as publicly as my siblings have. And you really just acknowledging that like I can peel those layers. And for me, I think regarding the kind of compassion that a lot of us still have for people who harm us, I think it's especially important, yeah, like Mel was pointing out, that just because there's still some semblance of like even love and compassion, yeah, that it's hard to forgive. And for my family's abuser, my father passed away before the book came out, sometime last year in February. And I think I, with the help and support of Amita Swadin, and them connecting me with indigenous peoples of Diné and Apache nations, Two-Spirit peoples, they helped us facilitate a fire ceremony for my father, and it was really, really emotional. And I think in doing that, we were able to, in our own way, kind of release and forgive. And I wish my other sibling I wish we would have thought of Zoom, honestly, for my other sibling to be present. But that to me was like definitely having that kind of compassion and acknowledging the harm that he's done, but also has experienced. And it's just such an important aspect of breaking that cycle that I really, really appreciate about everybody's pieces and about this moment, that to break that kind of cycle of harm, and how it's so important to confront it, not only in the interpersonal, but also the systemic. So thank you everyone. Thanks for everybody who's been watching and sharing and asking questions.
Nina, do you want to say anything?
You know, I thought that I don't have anything that would be very different from what I've read, so I didn't want to take up any space in case you wanted to move somewhere else.
Okay, that works. So there are two questions. So one asks, do any panelists have ideas about how to build community with other survivors and move away from work productively with a place of fear? I'm not at a place of disclosure outside of therapy, and in particular, I feel harming other survivors with my story or my feelings about harm I've experienced. Does anyone want to?
Yeah, I can start, and maybe folks can jump in. I would say that for me as a survivor, I experienced quite a long stretch of violence in my life, and it's no accident, I suppose, that my first job out of college was at the DC Rape Crisis Center. And I thought, I'm just going to be the volunteer coordinator, just like maybe go to the hospital with survivors. Like, yeah, something really bad happened to me, but like, this is not like related. And that was the first time in my life that I was politicized around that, and being a member of Insight was like the first time that I was actually politicized around my identity as more than a survivor, but as for being a child sexual abuse survivor as a part of my identity. Before that, I thought that it, of course, because of isolation and shame, I thought that it was just me, right? I thought that, yeah, probably other people have experienced this really bad unnamed thing. But hey, what can we do? And so like being in community with other survivors who were open about their stories, who were naming their experience, who were drawing connections like Kai named between like what is happening in their lives currently and what has happened in the past, really empowered me to like tell my own story, to ask my family members for accountability, and to really deepen my relationship with other survivors. What I'll say is, if you're feeling afraid of sharing your story publicly, some things that have really helped me include like journaling, um, uh, other kinds of like online spaces for survivors, and then groups. So lots of like local programs have like support groups for survivors where, you know, you're only engaging with those folks and no one else in the public, right? And everything that you're sharing in that space is confidential, but it can also like build a practice of telling your story and being validated and affirmed, and like just starting to realize that you're not alone, which I think for me, being in spaces like this with y'all is just so powerful, because it just reminds me and baby Alicia that we're actually not alone, and we've got really good siblings who are here to take care of us. So.
Yeah, I just want to commend you for showing up to this space, because I think this is a step of opening up, and through listening to other people tell their stories, I think it helps to just hear that you are not alone. And I really felt that, Mel, when you kept reiterating like you are not alone, it really hit me, and it started to like penetrate, and I could feel that building some kind of like strength and power within me. And I also want to say too that disclosure and talking about these things is scary and frightening, and it can take you to places that you maybe don't want to remember, or places that when you remember them, they change you again and they make you rethink how you're walking through the world again. So this healing is risky business. It's not an easy thing. It's challenging. And I think one of the best things, like Alicia was saying, is finding support groups, people where maybe if you're not ready to talk, you can just listen, like on this call tonight. So, but I just really want to encourage you to continue to seek that healing, because you deserve it.
And thanks, Kai. And I'll piggyback on what you and Alicia have said. And I will say that those first lines in that talk, I see you, I feel you, I got you. Those were the things that I said to myself when I started to dig up my little man, because I had stashed him away so far. So what I'm saying here isn't like just advice. It's really lived experience. It's what I told myself. It's what I was able to tell survivors when I spoke to them. And it's the same thing that I was able to say to those incarcerated men at Angola. It's a healing thing, and self-compassion goes a long way. So like my friend said, encourage you to find groups, listen if that's all you want to do or can do, and grow into your healing journey. It's a journey, and it's not easy, but I will say this too, and I think Aishah can second this. There have been so many get-togethers that we get to do with survivors, and many times it's joyous times when you find your tribe. So keep looking, don't give up, you are not alone. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to read the next question, which is from our sibling contributor, Tanya Lovelace. Like Alicia, because my abuser was removed from my life through the carceral system, it was like, you were good now. I feel like I'm healing the most, at least by my current stage of recovery from this unintentional harm. Is the same for you, Alicia?
Is it the same? Thank you, Tanya, for sharing.
Alicia, hold that thought.
Sure.
We're gonna just change interpreters.
Sure.
All right.
Or similar. Okay. Yeah. Tanya, thank you for that question. And I bet other folks too have thoughts about this. When my brother committed suicide, I was 12 or 13, 12. And I hadn't actually told anyone in my family about the abuse. And so when he died, I kind of swallowed it down and said, okay, like, I'm safe now. It wasn't necessarily that my family believed that I was safer because he was gone, because they didn't necessarily know that it was happening, or if they did, they didn't show that they knew. I swallowed it down and said, okay, there's no need to make a fuss now, right? There's no need to bring this up. He's gone, right? And so I think that one of the things that I've had to reconcile most is, like, what does justice and accountability look like for me when I will literally never get it from him, right? I will never have an opportunity to hold him accountable, to ask him questions, to hope that he changes his behavior, right? Because he was also a young person, right? He was older than me, but not that much older than me, right? And people shift and change. And I think many of us, we wouldn't be doing the work that we do or be in this space and where we are if we didn't believe in people's ability to shift and grow and change and be accountable. And so I think I really struggle with the feeling of, like, how do I get accountability and justice even if no one else is willing to be accountable for their behavior, right? Like, what are the things that I can do to self-soothe? I think compassion is a part of that, to like really help me have peace with, like, where I've been and have, like, healing for where I'm going. Because for many of us, we never get the justice or accountability that we seek from the folks who've done us harm, or the people who were bystanders in our lives, right? Whether they're alive or not, like, we often don't get those things from them. And so one of the ways that I get it is by being affirmed and present with y'all, right? Like, we get it sometimes for ourselves. We have to create it for ourselves, and then we, like, give it to each other. And that has been a really powerful part of my healing journey. Yeah. And I'll stop and see if other folks have things that they want to share too.
And we're winding down. We have about 8 to 10 minutes left before this webinar ends. So just want to, that wasn't a, therefore don't respond. Just want to give a context. Yeah. I'm trying to not be the moderator who speaks all the time. So
I don't know if this addresses a question or anything, but I just want to point out and say again, especially in this room, with all these Black voices and faces, and probably a lot of the people listening are Black voices and faces, go to therapy. My therapist is somewhere in this room, and thank God for her. I think and like you, Alicia, when I started working in the Rape Crisis Center, I went there thinking that I was going to do the work to help other people. I had no idea. Even when I started therapy, I went to therapy to manage the stuff that was going on with the crisis calls. I had no idea my stuff had any room in there, or that it was supposed to be there. So, and even still, I was in therapy for years before I even allowed the little girl to enter that room. So that's it. And she's on here now worried, like, just breathe and pace yourself, because she's nervous, because there are a lot of things that are coming up that we are still dealing with. You know what I'm saying? So I love my therapist. Get therapy is one of the best and most loving things I've ever done for myself. And I'm so proud of myself for that. So proud of myself for that. So that's something I just wanted to say.
Let me just give these two last questions, just so you all, and then whoever, just kind of do a popcorn style who wants to respond. Thank you all so much for your beautiful work. This is from Jenna Cohen. Coming from mainstream anti-violence work, I'm newly starting to explore ways of community accountability that doesn't include carceral systems. I'm wondering, with the discussion of compassion for harmers, if any of you have thoughts of if and when there's a place if we are engaging in advocacy with systems. That's question one. Two, and this will be the last one, my mom is now 94, and though quite spry and together, it seems that my bringing the abuse up now would be too much for her. What do you think? That was an anonymous person. Thank you.
God, I wish your mom was in here for that one. Aisha, I wish your mom was in here for that one. Hey, Miss Simmons.
My mom is here. Oh, you mean to respond? To respond.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. I guess because my mom's like 94, I was like, oh, that has nothing to do with me. But I don't know. I can't speak for your mother. But my mother, who I don't know if who's in her 70s. Let me just put that way. I was like pausing, like, can I say her age? I don't know. We are in accountability processes that started 4 years ago, right, in 2016. And she writes about her coming to terms with how she nor my father protected me for when I was a kid, and then just kept sending me back to the place, my grandfather's home, engaging and all this. So just dealing with all of this trauma and the imprint of trauma for 37 years. And so we're doing the work. And now, as a few weeks ago, my father is also in this process. So they're in their 70s, which is 20 years younger than your mom. I don't know if she's spry and able to talk. I feel like it's never too late to have the conversation. That's me as a survivor. I can't speak for how a parent would feel.
Yeah, I mean, I also can't speak for how parents would feel, but I also think it's really important to give, if, depending on your relationship with that person, to like give them an opportunity to show up for you, right? That may or may not work, but I think that, while you still have the chance, give them the chance, to give your mom the chance to show up for you, no matter her age, because it's never too late for her to kind of learn and start showing up for you. And I just deeply believe in people's capacity to heal and shift. And I think Rosa says in the chat, but like that we also can't control how other people respond. So thank you for naming that, Rosa. Like you can't respond how your mom control how your mom responds, but also it's, if it feels right to you and you feel called to name this, like give her a chance to show you support, and just wishing you well.
And I'd encourage to have a support system in case you don't get the response that you would like, in case there's defense in anything, that you want to have some space to hold you. I want to also acknowledge this comment that Luz Marquez Bimbo offered, I think in response to, I guess, what Inina J was sharing. And Luz is also a contributor to the anthology. She said, also therapy and healing comes in many different forms. As diasporic Black peoples, we have many tools, but unfortunately have forgotten or don't know them or lack access to our models of healing. And then Luz also says, I lost the opportunity to have such a dialogue with mom due to dementia. I've learned to let go of the guilt, thanks Aisha, and to find accountability as a parent with my children, since I didn't get it from our parents. And Lynn Roberts, another contributor on Monday, shared a similar experience about not being able to engage with her mother now because she has dementia. So it may be a profound gift that your mom is still spry and available hopefully engage. So I know that there was that previous question, and I see there's another one, and we're coming to an end of this webinar, and just really wanting to be quite mindful and respectful of not only the panelists, but also the interpreters who are really working to, also working as hard as us in terms of making sure that this conversation is accessible. What I will share is that there will be a contact information for everyone in this conversation, and including some of the interpreters. So to please think about utilizing ASL interpreters to make your events accessible. And then also there are several of us who are independent artists. So this is everyone is donating time and labor. Let me be very clear. No one is getting paid to be on this webinar. So all of that information, Edxie is an independent cultural worker. Enina J is an independent cultural worker. I am an independent cultural worker. And so that information will be there, as well as lists of resources around community accountability, transformative justice, restorative justice, how to access the art, Enina J's art, Edxie's art. So all of that will be in a PDF document accessible on Google Drive. Everyone who's registered for this event will have access to that. This video will be recorded and will be on Vimeo, as well as on the Love with Accountability Facebook page and website. All of that will be in links in a follow-up email tomorrow. So I want to just thank all of you, Edxie Betts, Alicia Sanchez Gill, Enina J, Kai Green, Mel Phillips, the interpreters, Yolanta Galloway, Pamela Collins, Nicole Schamberger, my partner, Sheila Alexander Reed, who is handing me notes and keeping me on task, and Lee Livingston Perrine, who was very instrumental in giving Sheila and I training on how to do a webinar, because without it, I don't even know how we would be here right now. So thank you all very much. And the conversation continues. All of the folks here are accessible. The people who are in the chat line, Rosa Cabrera, Luz Marquez Bimbo, Tanya Lovelace, all of us are accessible. And I will make sure, I mean, if you go to Love with Accountability Facebook page, as well as the website, and definitely the anthology, that all of our information is there. Support independent publishers. AK Press is the independent anarchist publisher who published this book in 18 months time, so we could get it out as soon as possible. It is available for $20 in print copy, and a special sale of $1.99 as an ebook copy. So if you have a copy, if you have resources, share it and discuss it. And may it be a tool for healing and for accountability. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, Aisha.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Bye. Thank you so much, interpreter.
All of us. I'm proud of all of us. I'm proud of all of us.
Pamela, Jolanta, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you, family.
Yeah,
Love
thanks,
being with you
family.
guys.
It was great. Good to
Thank
see y'all.
All right.
Y'all.
You all take care. Protective wishes.
Hey, Aisha, will we still be able to see the chat after this is over? Because I couldn't listen and do.
Click now in the chat and save chat. Go in the chat and save.
Okay.
Do it right now before I end the meeting.
Save chat. How do?
You see the little 3 dots?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you see save chat?
No. I
Okay,
just said.
let me save it. I'll save it and I'll send it to you.
Appreciate you, sis.
Oh yeah, but that's a different thing. Okay.
Well, you got it. Okay.
I got it. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Guy. Can I say hi, Guy?
Hey.
Thank you, Sheila, for the work. Thank you, sign language interpreters, so much.
Yes.
They're amazing.
All right.
They're still here.
Oh, hi, Emmy. I see you. Hi. All right. And Rita Singh, thank you. Okay. I'm going to end this. Don't do it. Feel you.